Welcome to episode 202 of the Various to Sundry podcast. I'm your host, Matt Harmon, joined live from the Vault Studio on the beautiful campus of Grace College and Theological Seminary by my good friend, my colleague, my co-host, and the man who is heading into the pulpit this weekend.
Yep.
John Scott Sloat.
A pulpit. I don't know what the pulpit would be, but a pulpit.
We can live with that, yeah. Though, of course, by the time this episode drops, it will have already happened.
Yeah, it'll be old news, 48 hours old.
Yeah, so we are recording in advance. We're actually recording on a Friday for an episode that won't drop until Tuesday. Primarily because I'm out of town next week.
Well,
you are out of town.
I'm out of town next week, too.
Late. Well, for the whole week?
I come back Friday afternoon.
Okay. I forgot. I thought you were out the last half of the week, not just the whole week. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Preaching this Sunday and then doing visits around the Maryland East Coast.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I will be in Texas.
Texas.
San Antonio.
I've heard wonderful things about San Antonio.
You've not been to San Antonio?
I've never been to San Antonio.
I think you'd enjoy it. It's got
That's what I've
a
been
nice
told.
Riverwalk area. The Alamo's there.
It's one of the few places my wife has been that I have not been.
Okay.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that's a small list.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she's not as well traveled as you are.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so that's going to have some consequences for the sports segment since we're recording early.
And what are you doing in Texas? You just vacation?
Yeah, because I take vacations in the middle of the academic term.
Mm-hmm.
No, I will be at two academic conferences. The Evangelical Theological Society Conference.
Okay.
Where I'll be presenting a paper.
On?
Typology.
Typology. Any particular text or just generally?
Just generally.
Okay.
So I'm presenting a paper and three other scholars are responding to it. Basically, it's my view of typology, both forward-looking and backward-looking.
Who's responding?
Daryl Bach.
Okay, Dallas, right?
Yep.
Is it Dallas?
Yep. David Firth.
Firth? Oh, how do I know that name?
So he wrote you remember in our reading group a couple summers ago we did, was it called like Welcoming the Stranger?
Yeah. That guy.
Yeah,
I enjoyed him. He was very good.
And he's also got a commentary out on Joshua.
I'm sure that's a wonderful...
In the same series as my Galatians commentary.
Oh, really?
And then Cynthia Westfall.
Okay, that one I don't know.
She is at McMaster in Canada.
Okay.
So they will each respond to my paper.
Okay.
And then we'll have a panel discussion.
That's great.
Yeah. And then at SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, I'm doing a paper on basically the assumptions and such that go into my belief that Peter actually wrote 2 Peter. Now, SBL is a much broader crowd than ETS. ETS is evangelical, so you've got people who are committed to the inerrancy of Scripture. So the authorship of 2 Peter is not really
debated there.
Mm-hmm. But SBL is including anybody who teaches Bible at any sort of institution.
So it could be Notre Dame Bible professors are there.
Yeah. So my view will be a significant minority in that context.
What sort of give me the Cliff Notes?
So
if that's even possible.
So, I mean, basically the Cliff Notes are my starting point is, well, the text says he wrote it.
Okay.
And so I think that the burden of proof then shifts to demonstrating convincingly that he could not have done it, could not have written it. Now, for critical scholars, they think there's enough proof that there's no way he could have written that. I respectfully disagree.
What do they take it as? Somebody adopting a pseudonym?
Yes. Yes, someone writing in Peter's name to address – so after Peter's death, writing in Peter's name as if Peter were still alive, this is how he would address the current situation that we're facing. So yes, that's so I'm defending the authenticity of 2 Peter in terms of Pete actually wrote it.
Okay.
So I'm curious. I'm going to use an analogy that I'm curious how that shakes out in the panel discussion that comes out. But basically, I use the analogy of a criminal case. And I say, okay, so when a crime's been committed, if it can go one of two ways in terms of the investigation, depending on, has anybody confessed? Like if somebody comes in and says, I did it, I committed that murder.
Yep.
Well, the confession still has to be verified, right? They don't just take the person's word for it. They have to corroborate it with evidence that they have based on other things and say, oh, this guy says he did it. And yeah, we found his DNA at the crime scene. We know he had a motive that he didn't like this person.
He was covered in blood,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have him on security camera showing, yep, that was him. But if there's no confession, then you have to build a list of suspects, and then you have to try to build a case inductively, essentially, from that.
You would say you have a confession.
Yes, we have a confession. Pete wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
And then so that puts that establishes a framework for thinking about the authorship of 2 Peter and saying, okay, so what corroborating evidence is there to support that he wrote it? So that's the analogy I'm working with, and I'm sure it'll be picked apart. And I'll get chased around the room, and it'll be fun.
But that's why you go to SBL, right?
Yeah. Yes. I'm somewhat regretting that I agreed to do this paper.
Who talked you into it?
I was invited by the guy who's head of the study group session, whatever.
Okay.
So
nice.
yeah,
Should be fun.
there's my academic life.
Well, we look forward to a full report in our next episode as
There
to
you
how that
go.
went.
Yeah, there you go.
Maybe that'll be our episode for the Monday Upon Return.
Well, I mean, we need content, so
Let's rehearse this paper, okay?
Yeah.
And now let's hear the responses.
There you go. If you'd like to get in touch with the show at VNSPod, you can email the show, variousandsunderpodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook and on YouTube, and we'd love for you to leave a review and a 5-star rating. And if you want to give us some feedback on the new podcast logo,
It's out there in the world.
it's out there. It's there with our faces on it,
Yeah.
our cartoonish faces.
Cartoonish yet oddly photographed as well.
Yeah.
If that
Yeah, sort of a mid-range kind of.
if that distinction makes sense.
Yeah.
What's funny is on my podcast app, I still have the old logo.
Which app do you use?
Pocket Cast.
Oh. Well, it's updated through Apple Podcasts. And that's weird. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, mine's updated through
What do you use, Apple?
I use Overcast.
Okay.
So yeah, I need to yeah. I don't know why that does that, but yeah. So if you'd like to comment on that, leave a review. Sure. Reach out to us. That'd be great. All right. So even though we're recording a little bit early, we will talk a little bit of sports. And since we can't talk about the weekend's games,
You just want to sort of look forward to some of those games, or
well, I mean, now they're in the past. I mean, by the time people listen to this,
yeah, that's
Michigan and Penn State will have played. That'll be a big game, and obviously big for the standings in the Big Ten national rankings, but also with the ongoing investigation into Michigan's illegal acquisition of opponents' signs.
yeah.
By the time this drops, I'm sure things will have developed. I mean, as we record on this Friday morning, there's word that that there's an expectation, I think, that that Harbaugh is going to get suspended. I think that's an expectation.
This season?
Yes.
For what? I mean, there's only so many games left.
Yes.
One of them will be most likely the Ohio State game.
Well, if he's suspended for this season, for any part of this season, I would think it would include. I mean, they played. Well, again, as of this recording, they have Penn State coming up this weekend, and then they have somebody else next week. I forget who. is it Maryland maybe? And then they have Ohio State.
Mm.
So we'll see. It'll be very interesting to see how this all is going to shake out.
And Georgia's got Mississippi this weekend.
Ole Miss.
Ole
Yes.
Miss.
Yep.
And then Tennessee's got Mizzou. Those seem to be the big games that are out there.
Yeah. Yep. That's probably right. Trying to think. Those are the big games. Yeah. So it'll be, the landscape could look very different depending on how that all shakes out.
Utah against Washington is out there. I guess that's a top 25 matchup, technically.
Yeah. Who do your Jets have?
We're on Sunday night. We're against the Raiders.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a winnable game for sure.
Well, so was Monday night. It was a winnable game.
Yeah.
And here we are.
Let's talk a little bit about the NBA season has started. We don't really focus on the NBA till we get to January, really.
Yeah, no one does until Christmas Day.
Right. So have you paid attention at all to the Knicks?
I get updates as to when they play, when tip-off is, and then I check scores.
Okay.
That's about as much as I've done thus far.
Okay. Yeah. I have not paid much attention. I actually looked at going to a Spurs game while I'm down in San Antonio. So I haven't decided if I'm going to do that or not. We'll see. But this in-season tournament thing is happening soon.
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen advertisements for that. I've seen some weird courts.
Yeah. My understanding is that basically they put all the teams into groups. So it's like a soccer thing almost. Like you have a group stage where you play everybody in your group. And then the winners of the group advance into like a, kind of what's the term I'm looking for? One and done sort of thing where you lose and you're out kind of thing. But what players get, I think, $500,000 on the winning team. Is that right? I think.
I have no idea.
I still think it's an idea that they need to flesh out a little bit more. We'll see how this goes.
It does feel a little half-baked.
Yeah. It seems crazy to think that $500,000 is not really that much incentive for most of these players. But, when you're making as much as they do, maybe it's not as much of an incentive. I don't know.
Maybe for the guy on the end of the bench.
Yeah.
It's $500,000 be worth it, but for Giannis, that dude's making so much money.
Yeah, if you're making $34 million a year.
Yeah. Did you see? This is so out of left field. Giannis Antetokounmpo, he doesn't put his money in the stock market, and because of the federal protections, is only I can't remember $250,000.
Mm-hmm.
He has like hundreds of bank accounts at different banks
that are
all $250,000.
Well,
isn't that wild?
Okay, but he's Greek, right?
He is, yeah.
Okay. The financial situation in Greece for the last decade plus
not good
has been a dumpster fire.
Yeah,
banks failing and that sort of so it brings a little bit of context to the you can understand how a guy might be like, I'm not trusting anything.
Oh yeah,
but beyond the guarantee. So, all right, you ready to move on, John?
Sure.
So our topic for today, John, what are we talking about today, and why are we talking about it?
We are talking about the differences between the Synoptic Gospels and John's Gospel.
Okay.
I'm preaching John this weekend, and frustrated's the wrong term.
Oh,
but
okay. Do tell.
There's part of me that reads John, and I'm just like, I don't get it. It's just it feels different to read than a traditional gospel. It feels different to preach than a synoptic.
Mm-hmm.
And it just sometimes I read a paragraph and I go, okay, what was the point? So I'd love to just spitball.
Okay.
Why is John so different?
Yeah.
And what are some strategies we can have in reading John that can help us interpret things? And what's going to help me on Sunday as I preach John?
Okay.
So, yeah, a little bit. There's a little cry for help.
Okay. All right. So how far along are you in the sermon prep process?
So I would say the sermon sits at about 80%.
Okay.
80, 90% written. I'm at the editing stage.
Okay, and
right
what's
now.
the exact passage again?
I have 8:12 to 30.
Okay, so right after the woman caught in adultery.
Yes.
It's the light of the
Yes.
world stuff.
The light of the world declaration right
Okay.
there at the top, and then no development of that. Just sort of right into a conversation with the Pharisees, kind of an argumentative conversation with the Pharisees. And then there seems to be a bit of a pullout to a larger conversation with Jews more broadly than just the Pharisees. That happens in the second half, the second paragraph.
Yes. Yeah. So where does it break again? Where are you cutting off?
So 8:12 to 30.
Okay. Ah, yes. Gotcha. Okay.
So this sort of back and forth weirdness with the Pharisees, and then some what I've termed in the sermon is sort of like Jesus goes from like this combative, argumentative thing with his enemies in sort of the first paragraph to like very similar points actually, but more persuasive oriented toward the broader coalition of the Jews.
Okay.
So that's how I'm sort of framing it. But
Gotcha.
But yes, it was just it took me a couple of days to really even wrap my head fully around the text, and there are still aspects of it that I talk about, but I don't know that I've fully developed. So yeah.
Okay.
That's the passage.
There you go. So I think when it comes to the Gospel of John, it obviously stands out from the Synoptics in a number of respects. And I think most scholars probably think that when John wrote this gospel, he was not only aware of the Synoptic Gospels, but even kind of writes it in a way that kind of assumes that the reader is at least maybe loosely familiar with at least some of the things in the gospel, according to in the Synoptic Gospels. So even the most conservative scholars tend to date the Gospel of John probably in the 80s, early 80s, whereas conservative scholars tend to date the Synoptic Gospels before 70 A.D. So that's one difference, and I think what are some of the other differences you have in mind, even as you've worked in John, between John and the Synoptics?
So as I work through the Synoptics, let's take a passage in Mark, right? The paralytic being lowered through the roof. Like there's a clear start to their story. Even the dialogue is just like real straightforward and clear. As I read through John, I kind of have it almost, particularly this passage, feels like it has like a lot of disconnected parts. So, for instance, we have "I am the light of the world" right at the top. That's a big statement, and then it kind of goes into the rest of that paragraph is about the Pharisees going like, "Well, your testimony is not true. We need another witness." All these things, and Jesus going, "Actually, it is true. Here's why." And kind of never puts a bow, at least in this passage, on the "I am the light of the world."
Yeah.
And then kind of goes into and then it transitions. So it doesn't feel like there's a clear development or intention and thought behind John's writing of it. It can feel that way as I'm reading through it.
Well, I think part of what you see with John is John tends to have fewer stories, fewer individual stories.
Yeah.
And longer dialogue stretches. This is overstating it. But at times it can almost feel like the story is a setup to the long extended sort of teaching that Jesus is going to give. Or it's a setup to the interactive dialogue between Jesus and the religious leaders, or Jesus and whoever else is in the story. So I think that's part of what's going on there. And I also think when it comes to the Gospel of John, what's striking to me is that John tends to assume that the reader is probably more familiar with Jewish customs and Jewish festivals than most English readers are.
Yeah.
And so I think that can be a barrier a bit to the English reader of Jesus will make statements that assume some kind of knowledge of a Jewish festival that the English reader often doesn't have.
Yeah, I was actually for this diving into the Feast of Booths for this sermon because that seems to be where it takes place in connection with, I think even going back to chapter 7.
Yes,
it connects to that. The other thing that I always march out as the differences between John and the rest of the synoptics is kind of like what you're talking about with your SPL paper, right? John at the forefront of his gospel has a confession, right? This is who Jesus is.
Yeah.
Where everybody, Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of have more of a inductive reasoning, right? They're sort of just like, let's take the evidence, let's go through these different stories and discover who Jesus is. Where John sort of gives it to you up front.
Yes, that's largely true. Though, the Gospel of Mark does begin with this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God.
Yeah, that's it, and then jumps into an Isaiah reference right there at the outset of Mark.
So there is that element, but there's nothing like John's prologue. I mean,
right,
and the other gospel accounts, they seem to start their story with the birth of Jesus or the arrival of John the Baptist. John starts in the beginning.
Yeah,
like
which
all the way back.
Kind of sets John up. And I was thinking about this as I was prepping this because I was prepping this. I'm like, gosh, I have a lot of Old Testament references in here. Did John really intend to have this many Old Testament references? Well, he kind of starts his gospel with an Old Testament reference.
Yeah, for sure.
And a few of them, I mean 1:1 certainly, but certainly 1:14 as well is also a Old Testament reference, and there's just a number of them. It's actually pretty incredible.
Yes, I think another thing that distinguishes John is just the whereas the synoptics tend to be a little bit more, I don't know if this is the right word, at points, I would say, a little more subtle about Jesus' deity. There is nothing subtle about John in his assertion of Jesus' deity.
No.
The synoptic gospels tend to be a little bit more like, I'm going to show you something that Jesus does that only Yahweh can do.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to expect you to make the connection. Or I'm going to show you Jesus saying something that only Yahweh can really say. And I'm going to invite you to make the connection of, so Jesus must be Yahweh in the flesh.
So he does that in John chapter 8, the passage that I'll be preaching. He uses this phrase called, he says, I am he. I am he. In John chapter 8, he says it two times. And I was reading that, and I just go, boy, that's quirky. And then you connect it to Isaiah, and you see that.
And then back on into Exodus.
And back on into Exodus, exactly. Yeah. But that's a phrase God used to say of himself, and to say that there is no Savior other than me.
Yeah.
I am he.
Yes.
In Isaiah 43. And boy, there's part of me that as I step into a pulpit to preach this, where I go, it took me several readings and a lot of commentaries to get at the main point of this. How do I bring them along in that and bring it about?
Yeah, and I feel like it's striking that I think oftentimes when you will hear people say, "Oh, you want to get someone in the Bible to learn about Jesus? Start with the Gospel of John." That's a fine starting point. But, it's one of those things where there's a lot of depth to the Gospel of John. And and so it invites multiple readings. It invites you to read it over and over and over again to see the multiple layers of the text. And That's part of the beauty of Scripture in general, I would say. But the reality is that we as contemporary English readers just often don't have the depth and breadth of Old Testament background to immediately catch things that would have been apparent to a first century Jewish reader, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just part of the challenge, I think, in terms of reading it, understanding it, and then preaching it and guiding people to the point where they see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think another thing, it's easy to focus on the differences between the Synoptics and John's Gospel, but I would want to say there is overlap, obviously. I mean, for all their variety,
mm-hmm.
all four of the Gospels spend a huge chunk of space on the last week of Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection. Like all four of them, as if they say, well, you can focus on different things leading up to that, but the essential thing you got to catch is that last week where he is arrested, he's crucified, he rises from the dead as the sort of the focal point, which is
in those big picture things, there's more similar than differences.
Oh,
there.
Absolutely.
And I've never thought of this before, but feel free to push back on it. But it does feel like as John's writing, he's like, yeah, we need to get this story about Jesus or this teaching of Jesus out there because Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't necessarily cover this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's an intentionality about John trying to include things that aren't found in the Synoptic Gospels. Like the feeding of the 5,000, that's in all four Gospel accounts. But
like the wedding at Cana isn't just in John.
Correct. And and you get a hint of that, actually, I think, at the end of John's Gospel when he makes that sort of enigmatic statement. Let's see here. John 21, very last verse of the Gospel account. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that could be written. It's almost as if he's like throwing up his hands and being like, I kind of give up. like there's the Synoptics out there.
Yeah.
There's my account, and we've only scratched the surface of the things that Jesus did and said. Which I don't know if this will be the case in the new creation, but I kind of wonder if we'll get to find out more of those.
Yeah.
Like we'll just get to hear more of like, oh, here's another story that God didn't include in the Scriptures, but this is something Jesus did.
Yeah.
That'd be pretty sweet.
That'd be pretty awesome. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah. So, and even just the way that there's some critical scholars like good old Bart Ehrman are one of our favorites.
Yeah, a Dookie.
Yeah,
in a couple of ways.
He's at UNC Chapel Hill.
I thought he was at Duke.
No.
He's at Chapel Hill.
He's a Tar Heel.
Interesting.
Yeah. So he, among other critical scholars, are basically like, oh, you can't trust the Gospel of John because when Jesus speaks, what you're really hearing is John speak because he's speaking in John's words and sayings and that sort of thing. And balderdash is what I say to that. But
is there anybody that upsets you more than Bart Ehrman?
Are we talking in the realm of like biblical studies, biblical scholarship? Is that how we're sort of parsing that out?
Sure. Yeah. Let's do that. I was thinking more broadly, but to save you from having to say anybody specifically, let's just do biblical studies.
Yeah, I mean he's certainly up there, in part because
he's done a lot of damage.
Well, and he's dishonest,
mm-hmm.
meaning that he will make broad, sweeping statements in his popular level writing that he would never make in his scholarly writing.
Will he be at SBL?
I would imagine so.
Will he be at your Peter?
I highly doubt it.
Interesting.
I highly doubt it. So
watch him bring up this podcast, and you're like, "Wow,
yeah, that would be epic."
That'd be next level.
Yes, for sure. You mentioned the story of the wedding at Cana. That's one of the I think one of my favorites in the Gospel of John. And one of the unique features of John as well is the fact that he fills in a little bit of the early interaction that Jesus has with his disciples.
Mm-hmm.
If you just read the Synoptic Gospels, you could get the impression that when Jesus walks along the shore of the Sea of Galilee and calls James and John, for example, that like they've never met him, he's this complete stranger, and here's this rabbi walking around going, "Hey, you two, come follow me." Like, okay, and they just drop everything. Well, when you read John's Gospel, you realize, oh, they've actually heard Jesus teach before. They've actually maybe been around him a little bit before Jesus gives that dramatic, like definitive, leave everything, come follow me. So that provides some interesting windows into, I think, that reality as well. But there was another difference I was going to point out, and I've lost it in my brain. It kind of walked away from me. What was it? Maybe it'll come back to me.
So any tips or tricks you have for the guy preaching Gospel of John? Any sort of things to be aware of, to think through as you're structuring? I think that's been part of my problem. Is like, goodness, how do I break this out into like 3 points or 4 points? Or
well, I mean, narrative in general can be difficult to, I think, break down into multiple points.
Mm-hmm.
My go-to with narrative more often tends to be what's sometimes referred to as the spa method. You heard of this?
Is it? I mean, it sounds like a hot tub where you're just
absolutely.
You're just sitting in it like soup.
That's right. Story, point, application. So in other words, you retell the story, filling in gaps and drawing in stuff as necessary. Then you summarize the point of the story, and then you apply it. Rather than trying to do, verses 3 through 7, here's my point. Verses 8 through 10, here's my point. Which either is fine. It's not like there are multiple ways to preach passages like that. So it's not like there's a one-size-fits-all. But sometimes if it doesn't naturally fall into that sort of point 1, point 2, point 3, I'll try to stick to the old spa method. But I also think you will when you preach or teach from the Gospel of John, you're just going to have to try to understand and then succinctly summarize the relevant Old Testament background to your passage. And I think commentaries can be helpful on that for sure in terms of giving you what you need.
But no need to quote the Mishnah or anything like that as you're working?
No, I would generally not recommend quoting.
I saw that pop up in a commentary where it's like, actually, this here is helped out by the Mishnah telling us this. And it's like, my goodness, I am not quoting the Mishnah.
No, but you can, that's something where if you feel like it's helpful for the listener to know, you could say something like, the Jewish tradition records that, and then summarize it up as opposed to necessarily quoting the Mishnah. But I still think the go-to commentary is Don Carson in the Pillar series.
Yeah, I think you're right.
That has and will stand the test of time. It's now 30 years old. That's hard to believe. One other commentary that I'll recommend more as a reference commentary, so you wouldn't necessarily read through it, is the commentary by Craig Keener, which Keener's strength is both Jewish and Greco-Roman background. That's his sweet spot.
That's his Huckleberry?
That is his Huckleberry for sure. So that's a good resource I wouldn't necessarily recommend. I think it's a 2-volume commentary. So reading through the whole section on your passage may not be time effective, but to dip into it and go, I'm curious about this. Oh, that's helpful. Thanks, Craig.
Yeah.
So those would be some recommended resources. And, checking in on the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament is always a good idea.
Yeah. Particularly that's in a new volume now, right? Has that been redone? No. Okay.
The dictionary of the New Testament use of the Old, which is a companion to that, just released this month.
Okay.
Yeah, that's I don't know if you saw me. I posted something on social media.
You did a couple of entries for that.
I did. I did the one on Galatians, Philippians, and then the Old Testament use of the Old Testament as compared to the New Testament use of the Old Testament. So that just came out. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I did a whole episode on that on my other podcast with my good friend Ben Glad, who's one of the editors.
I was about to say, he's an editor.
Yes. So you can check that out. That is called the Biblical Theology Briefing. So, all right, John, we should probably wrap up that segment and move on to This Day in Sports History.
All right, This Day in Sports History, November 14th, 2023. Where's the year going? It's flying by here. I mean, we're almost at Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Isn't that wild? Anyway, 1970, 43 members of the Marshall football team die when their chartered plane crashes in Kenova, West Virginia.
You're familiar with that story.
Yeah, I've seen the movie.
Yeah.
Who was in that movie? Who was the star? All right.
Matthew McConaughey.
Matthew McConaughey. There we go.
Yeah. And Matthew Fox, who was one of the lead guys in Lost.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right.
Played Jack, the doctor on Lost.
Yeah. 1985, Brewers released 39-year-old pitcher Rollie Fingers. Always good to get a Rollie Fingers reference in.
Yeah. I mean, he might have had the greatest mustache in baseball history.
Yeah, certainly baseball history. World history, I don't know. There's been some good mustaches out there.
Did you know that my father-in-law tried to replicate that?
Did he really?
When he was in that phase of life, yeah.
In
I don't know that it was
mid-80s?
in homage to Rollie Fingers, but he tried.
But it was a style.
He tried the handlebar, the curl it up on the edges.
Wow.
My wife will tell you that it was not a great look for him.
Interesting. 1993, Don Shula becomes the coach with the most wins in NFL history.
Mm-hmm.
Has that been surpassed?
That's a good question.
I feel like Belichick has got to be.
He's got to be, doesn't he?
I don't know. He's either right there or already there. 2009, Daniel. Is that a typo?
Nope.
Okay. Pasafume.
There you go.
Sets the NCAA record for most receptions in a single game. Catching 25 passes for Division III Hanover College. Pasafume finished with 153 receiving and 2 touchdowns in the 42-28 loss to Franklin.
Okay. So at first you hear 25 catches, and you're like, wow, that's amazing. But for only 153 yards?
Yeah. How many?
So that's like 6 yards a catch.
That's not great.
No.
Not great, Bob.
I mean, that's got to be swing passes, 20.
Bubble screens.
Yeah.
Yeah, got to be. 2010, here we go. The New York Jets defeat the Browns 26-20 in overtime at Cleveland Brown Stadium. The Jets, who won 23-20 in overtime at Detroit's Ford Field last week, are the first team in NFL history to win road games in overtime in consecutive weeks. I believe it was tied 20-20, and Mark Sanchez hit Santonio Holmes, who took it to the house on a slant.
Santonio Holmes.
Remember Santonio Holmes?
I will never forget Santonio Holmes. A Buckeye.
Yeah. Super Bowl catch.
Yeah.
But yes, I believe he took it as time might have been even expiring, or we were down the last minute or two in overtime, and it was going to end a tie. And Santonio Holmes took it to the house. I believe that's game. 2018, the New York Mets pitcher Jacob deGrom wins the NL Cy Young Award. His 10 wins is the fewest ever by a Cy Young Award winner in a non-strike shortened season. MLB leading 1.7 ERA.
Okay.
That's wild.
Yeah.
1.7 is low.
Get some offense there. Get him some help.
Well, He's now had second Tommy John surgery. I think in part because he's trying to throw the ball 102 miles an hour as a starting pitcher.
Yeah. So who do you like out of that list? I mean, there were two of them that were basically for you.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. We don't have regular occasion to talk about Rollie Fingers enough.
You want to go with Rollie?
Yeah, let's go with Rollie, lest I be called a homer.
Okay. We can do that. One thing you liked.
I'm going to talk family weekend. So I just came from a meet and greet with parents of current students who are on campus this weekend. So they're going to get to go to some ball games. There's a cookie crawl across campus. So
what pray tell is a cookie crawl?
I believe each dorm has baked or developed some sort of cookie, and parents and their kids can go from dorm to dorm, see the dorm, get a cookie.
But they are not required to actually crawl.
No.
Okay.
No, I think it's supposed to be the Christian college version of like a bar crawl where you go from bar to bar to bar. But that's going on this weekend. We have something like 500 registrants for this event.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's well attended. I saw probably 30 or 40 sets of parents this morning at the little coffee and Danishes that we had. So there's some nice folks.
Okay.
Some nice folks.
All right. Gotcha. I am going to go with something that happened last week, but I'm just going to go with it.
Go with it.
It's our podcast. We do what we want. We're 202 episodes in, and it's our podcast.
That's right. We talk about sermons that we're prepping.
I went to the Purdue versus Grace game, as did you.
Yeah, we sat next to each other, actually. Yes. By coincidence.
Yeah,
that was not planned.
That was not planned, no. But that was a lot of fun. You know, Grace being an NAIA school and being, ranked number 2 in the country in the NAIA. So obviously an elite level NAIA school. Playing number 3 Purdue, number 3 in the NCAA Division I end of things.
Yeah, we could just leave it at number 2 Grace against number 3 Purdue.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a great opportunity for Grace to play against a top caliber team like that. And I'm sure it's an amazing experience for the players.
Oh, yeah.
But it was a fun crowd, up in that Grace section there. And
it was a good time.
Yeah.
It's a really good time.
So I had 3 people with me in my car on the road trip there. So I had my son Jake, his girlfriend Autumn, and Isaac.
Oh, yeah. Isaac had better tickets.
Yes. He got his through a slightly different source than me.
Yes.
And that proved to be beneficial to him.
Yep. It was a lot of fun. It was fun to see that place rocking. It was definitely sold out.
Yes. And Mackey Arena is a great place to watch a basketball game. I mean, we were, second row from the top, literally like as far up basically as you could.
It wasn't too high.
And still very good sight lines. You felt like you were, not just so removed from the game that you weren't part of it.
Yeah.
Just a great experience. So that was my one thing I liked. All right, John, we got to wrap this up. We both have places to go, people to see, things to do. We have talked a little bit of sports, not as much as usual. We have talked about the differences between the Gospel of John and the Synoptics. We have talked Rollie Fingers. And we have talked about the cookie crawl here at Grace.
Yeah, the cookie crawl.
Yeah. And we've talked about the Purdue versus Grace basketball game. So I think by definition, we have covered our various and sundry topics. And so all that's left to say is, until next time, the Lord bless y'all real good.
Later.